The NES, a console born during the golden age of video games. In the next 10 minutes, we'll explore how Nintendo found unbelievable success and saved console gaming in America. Let's dive in. To start our story, we need to go back before computers, before Finland, and before video games existed. Nintendo, originally known as Nintendo Koppai, was founded on September 23, 1889 in Kyoto, Japan. Nintendo is older than 63 different countries, and when Nintendo was founded, the automobile was a new invention. The founder, Fusajiro Yamauchi, had originally founded Nintendo Koppai to produce traditional Japanese Hanafuda playing cards, and continued to produce said cards for over 70 years, in doing so, carving a modest niche for Nintendo Koppai. But during the 1960s, card games were losing popularity fast due to their new electronic competition. Nintendo Koppai knew only a monumental change would save the company that they had built. Simplifying their name to just Nintendo, Yamauchi didn't exactly know where the company's future lay. So, from the mid-1960s to the early 1970s, Nintendo jumped around a little bit. From taxis to instant rice, there really wasn't anything they weren't willing to try. They caught a nice break in the early 1970s with their Nintendo Beam Gun toy. This was Japan's first electronic toy, and it sold over 1 million units, setting an entire new narrative in the toy market. Now that you know why Nintendo was founded, you might wonder about why Nintendo decided to make consoles. To answer that, we need to talk about the infamous Space Invaders was released by Taito to arcades in Japan during April 1978, thus initiating the proclaimed golden age of video games. Technology was rapidly improving and more advanced games were popping up left and right. The video game industry only continued to skyrocket, reaching new heights as competition between companies strengthened. But just because the Famicom console has not been released yet doesn't directly mean that Nintendo's been out of the picture. Nintendo had a part in making over 30 unique arcade games, and business for the Nintendo company couldn't be better. Their groundbreaking arcade game Donkey Kong released on July 9th, 1981, making Nintendo millions. Nintendo's success in the arcades drove them to seek more out of video games. So Nintendo decided to begin work on a new console, and they're shooting for the stars. Led by Masayuki Yoremura, Nintendo began designing a whole new console that would leave their competitors in the dust. Technology so advanced, no one would catch up for a year, and a price so good, no rival could even try to match it. To make this console, Nintendo had to be both cheap and impressive, making sure to endorse their costs in the right areas and be frugal in others. This is actually why the controllers on the Famicom console aren't removable, as adding ports would have driven up the cost. This choice, however, meant if a controller broke, there was no way of replacing it. The D-pad used on the Famicom controllers were initially invented for the Donkey Kong Game & Watch system in 1982. The Famicom was originally going to be called the Gamecom, but system designer Masayuki Yoremura's wife suggested the name we infamously know today. Fun fact, the Famicom's color scheme was chosen by Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, after he saw a billboard would choose the same color scheme. Another big choice made when designing the Famicom was to make it look like a toy, which aimed to increase the marketability for their child audience. Another interesting feature is that one of the two Famicom controllers had a microphone in place of the start and select buttons. By 1983, the Famicom was ready to release. So let's move on to Nintendo released the Famicom in July 1983. Saying that the Famicom was popular in Japan is like saying that outer space is big. The Famicom had 2 games on its release, Popeye and Donkey Kong. This pair of titles was actually quite ironic. The original arcade Donkey Kong was based on the Popeye cartoons, but due to licensing issues, Nintendo couldn't actually use the characters Popeye, Olive Oil, and Bluto. The Famicom was not an overnight success. It instead sold steadily. Running up to the holiday season of 1983, Nintendo found a major issue with the Famicom. Consoles would freeze during gameplay. Nintendo quickly found out this was due to a faulty circuit in the system. Nintendo recalled all the faulty Famicoms and halted production until the issue was resolved. This cost Nintendo huge amounts of money and tons of lost sales. But ultimately, Nintendo would not sell a product if they knew it was faulty. This helped carve a caring and trustworthy image for Nintendo, which would help the Famicom in coming years. A more shady strategy Nintendo used to gain popularity was wording all their contracts so that third-party developers could only develop games for Nintendo hardware. All the game designers would sign the stipulations if it meant being able to release games on the Famicom, effectively ending Sega's chances of challenging the Famicom's rule. Within 2 years, the Famicom had sold over 2.5 million units. That is insane. With this overwhelming success, Nintendo decided they needed to expand their horizons and sell to the rest of the world. You might think that the NES was the first time the Famicom had left Japan and entered the United States, but this isn't the case. The first time the Famicom was seen in the US was actually inside the Versus System arcade games. These systems used the Famicom's strong hardware to allow two-player arcade games. These arcade cabinets became so popular during the 80s that Playmeter ranked them as some of the most popular arcade games in the country. This is when Nintendo truly started to consider releasing the Famicom in America. For this launch, Nintendo had to tread carefully. If their console was anything like an Atari console, the consumer would immediately lose interest. For a long time, this new console was going to look nothing like what we know it to be today. One standout example is a prototype that looked much more like a computer than a video game console. With a keyboard and a joystick, this prototype is interesting to see. Imagine if this is the console Nintendo decided to release. Nintendo focused on making this new redesign familiar to the consumer, so anyone could pick it up and figure out how to use it. They did this by making it front-loading. This made it similar to a VCR, something a lot of people were familiar with at the time. By 1985, the Famicom, now titled the NES, is ready to release. Initially, Nintendo wanted the help of a different company to launch the NES. Nintendo asked Atari. Atari was the prevalent games company in America at the time. The deal was going well, and Nintendo was willing to sell the distribution rights for anywhere outside of Japan to Atari. They were so close to an agreement, Nintendo was actually going to sign the distribution contract that year. It was all going well, until Atari saw Coleco demonstrate an unlawful port of the Donkey Kong arcade game on their hardware. They refused to sign the contract, thinking Nintendo was also forging a deal with Coleco, so Nintendo had to pull up their bootstraps and release it themselves. Thus, they formed the Nintendo SWAT team. This dedicated 12-person team, led by Minoru Arawaka, had the task of selling the NES in America. For this first test launch, the Nintendo SWAT team had assembled the original set, which had sold for $249. It included the console, 2 controllers, the Rob toy, the Zapper light gun, and 2 games. Those 2 games being Duck Hunt and Gyromite. So to release this set in America, you'd assume Nintendo would do the reasonable thing, launching slowly in small locations, making sure the NES was ready to be sold. But they had other plans. Nintendo launched the NES in New York, the largest market in the USA, with a $50 million budget. As you'd expect, this didn't go too well at first, and sales throughout the holiday season were encouraging but not very high. But this did give Nintendo the courage to branch out, selling the NES across the nation. Nintendo didn't release the NES nationwide right after the successful first launch in New York. Instead, they opted to release it gradually, partially due to production limitations. Nintendo released it to LA in February 1986, and then soon after to Chicago, San Francisco, and finally nationwide in July. By the end of 1986, roughly 90,000 NES systems were sold, along with 460,000 game cartridges. That's a lot. In 1986, the console video game market as a whole was worth $430 million. Nintendo made $310 million of those dollars. That is insane! By 1989, the NES had held the American console video game market for 3 years. All good things must come to an end. Nintendo released the final first-party NES game, Wario's Woods, in December 1994. NES support was left alive until August 14th, 1995. It's very easy to underestimate how important the NES is, even to this very day. I believe without it, console gaming in America would still feel the effects from the market crash of the 80s. Sure, eventually, console gaming would gain popularity again, but without the NES, I believe consoles would be so much less prevalent in modern America. The NES was supported for 9 years. 9 years of a miracle. Nintendo has gone on to do amazing things, and they continue to innovate up until this very day. It's been almost 40 years since the NES was released, and I think if there's one thing, just one thing you take away from the story, it should be that when things get tough, you just have to dive in.